All right. Well, welcome everyone. Our sort of first time on hopefully what will be an ongoing IACM program session where we're going to honor the award winners for the Outstanding Dissertation Award, the Outstanding Publication Award, and the Negotiation and Conflict Management Research Article of the Year Award. We are going to begin with the Outstanding Dissertation Award, and I'm going to pull up my notes on that committee so I can do it justice. But that committee this year was chaired by our at-large board member, Tony Kong, with the committee members of Jian Cao, Chris Bauman, Emma Levine. We are thrilled to honor Hemant Kakkar and hear about his research. He finished his PhD in 2019 at the London Business School. And he's going to start us off by presenting that work. So congratulations, Hemant, and I look forward to hearing about your work. Thank you.
Thanks, Taya. Thanks for the kind introduction and this award. Very happy to share my work. So hopefully you are able to see my presentation. Okay, so hi, I'm Hemant Kakkar. I'm an assistant professor at Duke University's Fuqua School of Business, and this dissertation was done at London Business School. And I also realized, that every school, every institution has different norms of what a dissertation should look like. So in my case, it was a 3-chapter dissertation on a common underlying thread. So, and that's what I'll go and try present in the spirit of, just showing the award for which was presented. And it's a lot of work. So what I'll do is I'll give you a brief idea of what those 3 chapters are, what was the main question about it, maybe talk about one of the studies, empirical studies in each of those chapters. And the last chapter is a forthcoming work. So maybe I'll talk a little bit more about the empirical work for that chapter. So, so with that, let me just start. So one of our fundamental desire is to know where things stand. We are not only interested in the ranking of products or the brand we use, the organizations we work for, or the school we study, but we also want to know where we stand in comparison to others in the society, and especially in the domain or dimension that we really care about. And this idea of social rank can be seen across a number of domains. It's present in this digital age, whether based on how many likes and friends I have on social networks. It's there in the feudal societies, since writ large, societies are organized in hierarchy based on jobs, based on rank, based on caste, and so on. And even in egalitarian societies, which are not inherently hierarchical, there is still this idea about who has higher social rank. It could be displayed in terms of the way people don their attire, the headgears they wear, and so on. So in short, this idea of social rank permeates our social landscape, permeates hierarchy. And in many ways, one can talk about these informal ranking or social rank as this idea of status. So the higher informal or formal rank you have along that value dimension, the more your status. And status is desirable because it leads to a number of benefits. It leads to more reproductive success, health and longevity. It leads to influence. Such high status people are paid higher. They receive unsolicited help, to name a few. And as such, it's not surprising that this desire, this upward drive for higher status is discussed as one of the fundamental needs, one of the fundamental human motivation. So the question then becomes, how do people attain these higher ranks? And delving on the work of anthropologists, evolutionary psychologists, and social psychologists, they basically discuss, broadly we can think of this in terms of 2 ways in humans, how people attain rank along this idea of dominance and prestige. And these 2 pathways are considered equal yet alternate ways of attaining and maintaining status. So the 2 broadly different ways in which people can attain high social rank. So what is dominance? So the dominance is associated with individuals who are seen as assertive, controlling, forceful in their demeanor. These individuals are guided by the need to control others. They are the ones who do not hesitate to speak up. They are very confident, they are agentic, and they often drive the conversation where they are. So in many ways, individuals associated with dominance are perceived as confident, agentic, and controlling. They're also self-oriented. They care more about their own goals, their own ambitions, rather than about others. So a lot of time it's about what they want and how they want to achieve that. And as such, they don't mind in engaging in these coercive, intimidating tactics, and sometimes even use physical dominance as a way to achieve their objectives. So what are the mechanisms which leads these individuals to attain high social rank? And there are two kinds of mechanisms which have been generally talked about. One is because they come across as so confident, they come across as so forceful, they are perceived as competent. It's another issue whether they have competence, but they are perceived as competent. So that's what drives the effect. And in certain instances, they also intimidate others. It's this idea of psychological intimidation, which can also drive this effect of why these individuals are granted higher social rank. And there has been a lot of empirical evidence supporting the case of dominance for higher rank among humans, among group. And for me, the most surprising result is this meta-analysis of 85 years, which was done by Lord et al. In small group studies, and where they found the two most important factors which predicts leader emergence or influence was intelligence and trait dominance. And in fact, trait dominance had a bit more higher predictive validity and robustness than even intelligence. So just speaking about the role of intelligence. The other factor which is largely concentrated to humans but is not really exclusive to humans is this idea of prestige. So what is prestige? Prestige is associated with individuals. It's this idea of garnering them respect and admiration to those individuals who have certain knowledge. It could be cultural knowledge, it could be task knowledge, and when those individuals are willing to share those knowledge and skills with others. So as a result, others around them could learn from these individuals' knowledge, expertise, and skill set and advance themselves. And in return, they grant these individuals with respect, admiration, and hold them in high esteem. So that's the idea of prestige. And the mechanism driving this effect is broadly is about perceived generosity. Because they are ready to share their knowledge, because they're ready to come across as helpful, people endow them with respect and admiration and higher social rank. And as such, there is a lot of empirical evidence as well for supporting this route to social rank as well. There is Hardy and Van Woog's stuff about competent altruism hypothesis. There's Rob Willer's work and Frank Klim's work showing how helping others can lead to high status. And building on this, a paper by Joey Cheng et al. In 2013, they in a set of experimental studies and also a little bit of correlational studies as well, they find that both dominance and prestige lead to high status in small groups. So basically saying, these are two alternate different ways of achieving similar kind of social influence in social groups. So this idea of dominance and prestige, they also there are key differences between individuals who are associated with these kind of hierarchical orientations. So as discussed, dominance is more about being competitive, prestige is more cooperative, dominant care about self-serving, prestige are high on this need of affiliation. There's higher level of basal testosterone among dominant individuals. They speak in lower pitch voice, and it is exactly the opposite for prestige. When they talk, they have a downward head tilt, so that is a way to intimidate others. They have an expansive body postures, whereas for prestige, it's more an upward head slant and a submissive body posture. So all in all, saying there are both psychological as well as physiological differences associated with dominance and prestige. So this idea of dominance and prestige became a running theme across my dissertation and across the 3 chapters that I pursued during my PhD. And the 3 questions I asked was, why are there inconsistent findings for the punishment of high status actors following ambiguous transgressions? When and why do we want dominant leaders? When do we vote for them? When do we endorse them? And then what happens if we end up working under a dominant leader? How does it affect employee psychology? So to motivate chapter 1, I'll start with this example of which was quite an uncanny example. So here are these two individuals. On your left, you see Timothy Geithner. On your right is Tom Daschle. Both are high status individuals. Timothy Geithner was the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and he played an influential role during the 2008 financial crisis. Tom Daschle was a well-renowned politician from South Dakota. He served as both the majority and minority member in the US Senate. So both pretty well-known, pretty prominent figures in their own domains. And in 2009, both of these gentlemen were nominated for the secretary position. Geithner for the Department of Treasury and Tom Daschle for the Department of Health and Human Services. More than that, there was another similarity between the two of them. As soon as they were nominated, both of them were questioned on their tax returns. Both of them was said that they did not pay their taxes properly. And both of these gentlemen feigned ignorance. They said all of this was unintentional. Geithner blamed TurboTax for his tax trouble, saying TurboTax, the software didn't account for it. Whereas Daschle said, I wasn't supposed to know I am to pay tax about the certain gifts that I received. But the similarities between these two gentlemen ended there. So Geithner went on to become the Treasury Secretary. His nomination was confirmed. Whereas in the case of Daschle, there was a lot of hue and cry. There was a lot of censure, and he had to withdraw his cabinet nominee. So this is just one example, why these two high status individuals with similar kind of background, similar kind of virtual infractions, and similar kind of positions they were to hold, but they were all both treated very differently. So why is there this divergence in punishment of high status actors? And if we look at the literature, we find the same mixed findings within the status literature. So high status British parliamentarians were targeted more for their infractions, whereas Ellison, Fragile et al. Also found the same effect. And when they looked at why is that happening, it was found that high status individuals' actions were considered as more intentional. Even though it could have been an ambiguous transgression, it was considered more intentional. The other set of literature finds that high status actors are actually punished less. And the reason this literature finds is that these individuals are granted greater moral credentials. And by moral credentials, I mean is the very same transgression is seen as less unethical. And that is driven by the past virtuous history of the transgressor. So if a transgressor has a virtuous history, is known to be a good person or a moral person, they see the same transgression as less wrong compared to someone who does not have that kind of a history. So in a way, they are granted more moral credentials. So both of these mechanisms are at play, and the literature, at least until now, was finding that sometimes high status actors are punished more and sometimes they are punished less. So to get around this idea, in this chapter, I argued, that maybe it's not really about high status. It's more about the status type that could determine when high status actors are punished versus when they're not. And specifically, I argued that if an actor's high status is based on dominance, they will be punished more than if their status is based on prestige. And this would be explained because, as I explained, dominant individuals are self-oriented and all of that, their actions would be considered as more intentional. And as a result, they will be granted less moral credentials, which will explain the more punishment judgment that is given to them in comparison to prestige individuals. So I tested this effect across a bunch of studies, including an archival study of National Hockey League players, where I found that high status dominant NHL players were granted more penalties in minutes compared to high status prestige individuals. I also tested it in a lab, very involved lab experiment where we brought in a professional actor who acted as a confederate and engaged in dominance or prestige displays. And we found that the same actor was punished more when he engaged in dominant displays than when he engaged in prestige displays. And finally, in another study, we used a 2x2 design where manipulated both dominance and prestige, high and low, to examine the whole model. And that's the study. I'll just briefly talk about what we did in this study. So in this study, I actually took pretty much the same transgression which was shown in previous paper by Fragile et al. And I basically said that there is this high status person who did not pay his personal income taxes. So he underpaid those taxes. But it could have been ambiguous. It could have been unintentional, just like the first example we saw, because federal tax have become increasingly complex. So some of these transgressions could be a result of simple mistakes, while others could be a deliberate attempt to pay lower taxes. Participants read this based on the conditions they were assigned to, and then this answer responded to these measures. How harshly should Mr. Wallace be punished? Should a case be filed against him? Then we measured moral credential, basically asking how wrong was this behavior, and intentionality. Was this a deliberate action on his part? So in terms of manipulation checks, as you can see, we had a main effect for prestige. So you can see people in the high prestige condition were granted more status than those in the low. There was a main effect for dominance. So red bars are higher than the blue bars. And also there was an interaction for our manipulation check. So when the person was both high on prestige and high on dominance here, this person had the greatest status. So in ways our manipulation worked as intended. In terms of punishment judgments, we found a main effect for prestige. So lower punishment when the person was discussed high on prestige than when on low on prestige. A main effect of dominance. So you can see the red bars are higher than the blue bars, the sum of it. So the person was punished more in the dominance condition. And there was no interaction. Basically, these were two main effects of dominance and prestige that was driving this effect. For intentionality, we replicate the same pattern. Prestige, people were assigned less intentionality. Dominance, people were assigned more intentionality, and there was no interaction. For moral credentials, as discussed, the effect was opposite. Prestige, people were granted greater moral credentials than those low on prestige. Dominant individuals were granted less moral credentials, and there was again no interaction. And when I put all of these together in a single model, we find the support for this model that dominant people are punished more than prestige, and intentionality and moral credentials explain this effect. We ran another bunch of studies ruling out many alternate explanations, and overall the effects remains robust. So in terms of theoretical contribution, the main contribution the study made was to reconcile an inconsistent finding in the literature and basically making a case that these transgression judgments are not bound to status, but the status type of the individual. And that's what we should be looking more at. The next chapter I looked at, was the question, which was, we know we punish these dominant actors. Then when and why do we prefer these dominant actors or dominant leaders over those who are high on prestige? And this question came this was around the time of 2016, 2017, when I just moved from, I was in the UK and I was exposed, all of these things were happening around the world. So in India, a very right-wing government came and won the election in 2014, and they won again in 2019, very handsomely. Brexit campaign was going on in the UK, and people were endorsing to the messages of Nigel Farage and so on. Erdogan came in Turkey, and in the US 2016, we all know Trump won the election, and even the recent election, he recorded record polling. So the question was, why are we seeing the rise of these dominant actors when on the surface, we do not like them? And I argued in this chapter that is the role of environment uncertainty in the environment increases the preference for a dominant leader. When being in an uncertain world is not a very good state. People want to know the future. And when they are in this kind of an uncertain environment, they are ready to take even extreme action to achieve certain kind of certainty. And that's when they want a leader who they think is very self-assured, agentic, and decisive. And which is what we argued here, that increases the appeal of a dominant leader. And it kind of goes well with John Joss's argument about, our political needs is kind of a matching process of our psychological need. If we are in this uncertain environment, we want someone who's very self-assured and agentic, and that's what increases the appeal of a dominant leader. And again, there's a bunch of evidence from the uncertainty literature basically showing, when the environment is uncertain, people really prefer leaders who are more masculine, who are action-oriented, and who are very agentic. And why is that driving the effect? Is because when people are in an uncertain environment, they feel there's a lack of control. There is this lack of control, and need for control is another fundamental human motivation that people want to have. And when they are in this kind of a state, they would do anything to achieve certain kind of control. And it's an aversive feeling which people want to change. So we argue this need for control is kind of driving this effect as a compensatory strategy. So people compensate for having lack of control in one domain by trying to get a leader who can compensate for the lack of control. And there is a lot of empirical evidence. Most of the work is done by my colleague here at Duke University, Aaron Kay, who shows this, that when there is lack of control, people engage in compensatory strategies such as greater belief in agentic gods, preference for hierarchy, and government, and so on. So based on this, this is the kind of model I propose, that uncertainty would increase preference for a dominant leader, and this would be explained by people's need for control. And I test this across a bunch of studies in the US sample, asking for different versions of a DV based on validated scales of dominance and prestige, the kind of dominance characteristics they want in the leader. If there is a choice between a dominant and a prestige leader, who would they like? I also find the support for this across a global sample of about 140,000 respondents from 70 countries supporting this effect, and lack of control mediating the effect. So very quickly, I'll just show you the results. So in this study, we surveyed about 800 participants from 50 states in the US. We assigned them to high or low control manipulation. We asked them to report their zip code they were living in. And for each of the zip code they reported they were living in, I looked at the housing vacancy rate, unemployment rate, and poverty rate for each of those zip code to calculate the economic uncertainty in their environment. And then I asked them about what kind of a leader would they want between a dominant or a prestige leader, so a binary choice, or a trade-off between a dominant leader's and a prestige leader's characteristics. So this was more on a continuous scale. And what we find is this interaction effect that we propose. So the interaction between personal control and economic uncertainty was significant. When we look at the interaction, what we find is, so on the x-axis is economic uncertainty, which is increasing. So the greater the economic uncertainty and the lower the personal control, people prefer more of a dominant leader. In the high personal control condition, the slope was not significant. We find pretty much the same interaction for the continuous variable. Again, with low personal control and increase in economic uncertainty, people want a leader with more dominance characteristics. And this was, in this case, this was opposite in the case of high personal control condition, they wanted less. So overall, this chapter showed, that individuals prefer dominant leader in situations when they are surrounded by uncertainty, and this is explained by the lack of personal control. So the final chapter was looking at, we punish dominant leaders, we want them in uncertainty. Now what happens if we are working under a dominant leader? How does that affect individuals working under them? And the part of this chapter's motivation came from this book I was reading around that time by Amy Shua, which is called Political Tribes. And the book is mainly based on political identities and how that drives national politics. But towards the end of the book, she talks about, this idea of, and this was 2018 or 17 when this book came out, that today no group in America feels comfortably dominant. Every group feels attacked, pitted against other groups, not just for jobs and spoils, but for the right to define the nation's identity. In these conditions, democracy devolves in zero-sum group competition. And there was a big podcast just talking about this idea of why there is zero-sum group competition based on identities. And from here, the idea which came upon, maybe what happens is when individuals are working under a leader who is dominant, they develop this idea of zero-sum calculus about that my success is hinged on other person's failure. So only one of us can achieve success, not everyone can achieve success. So, and this leads to this idea of zero-sum mindset. So, which basically defines people's mental schemas of what could lead to success. How do I construe success? It's essentially looking at this tension between self-interest and other interests. And you can think of this on a continuum, So on one side, people can have this idea that everyone can flourish. We can all achieve success together. And on the other hand, it could be like I can only achieve success at the expense of others. And that's the idea of zero-sum mindset. The more you are on the right, the higher you are on the zero-sum mindset. And it has been shown to lead to a number of negative outcomes. In the interest of time, I'll just skip that. And the whole idea here was, when individuals are working under a dominant leader, all they see is who this leader is, how is this person behaving, he or she is behaving, based on in achieving their goals. So a lot of work on mental schema is, at least in the OB areas, looking at motivation and relational ties. But here I took a social cognitive approach, because what we do is not just a manifestation of what leader asks us to do or what the rules of the organizations are, but we also understand what we also behave based on how we understand what the leader is doing. So if a leader is a dominant leader, or any leader, we ask first a question: what is the right response in a given situation? And dominance, as opposed to prestigious leaders, are seen as using hard influence tactics, using tactics that are more self-serving in nature. For example, they are happy to segregate competent employees as long as it helps them preserve their own status, monitoring employees who questions them, prioritizing their own goals. So this all comes naturally to these leaders. So basically, they see these leaders are using these competitive behaviors as a means to success. And I argue, this competitive feeling then seeps through, drills down to co-workers as well. They start thinking, others' progress might hurt my chances of progress. So they develop this idea of zero-sum mindset, and as a result, it would show off in these reduced discretionary pro-social behaviors, such as interpersonal helping in the workplace and in society at large. So since the leaders' influence tactics are based on compliance rather than internal state of commitment, we argue, that interpersonal helping behaviors of employees and individuals will be reduced when they are guided by a dominant leader. So that's the model that we tested in this chapter. In study 1, we looked at a world value survey, and this was a data about 140,000 participants from various countries, and we measured their zero-sum mindset using this item, which asks people, whether you can get rich at the expense of others, or whether wealth can grow so there is enough for everyone. And we also looked at their tendency to help others based on this question, which asked them how important it is for you to help people living nearby to care for their well-being. To get at the independent variable, whether the leader is dominant or not, I looked at this political database which ranked each country based on whether it has a democratically elected leader or an authoritarian dictator-like figure. So the idea being, the more authoritarian the leader, the more dominant they are. And I also controlled for a bunch of factors that could drive people's tendency to help others or increase their zero-sum mindset. So for zero-sum mindset, what we see is, with or without control, we see that it leads to greater zero-sum mindset if the leader is dominant. And this is basically citizens of that country controlling for a number of fixed effects. And the same thing leads to less helping behavior among the citizens of those countries and zero-sum mindset. So if you put all of this together in a model, both of these things still remain significant, including a bunch of control variables, and the mediation works as expected. Again, it was a correlation design, so it does not really account for a lot of other things. So next study, I basically manipulated dominance and prestige using actors. So we used, the design was a leadership style based on dominance and prestige, and an actor using both genders, male and female. So we invited these professional actors and professionally created these videos in which these actors acted out in a dominant or prestigious way in the lab. And then we brought in a bunch of participants. We asked them, you will be working with these individuals, and we will be working under these leaders. And before you start working on that, report on a bunch of these factors. So basically, we found support for our model for both kinds of helping behavior, person and task focused helping. The only limitation one could ask for, would this effect generalize to real employees working in organization? And that was what we tested in the final study. So we used a two-wave study. At time 1, employees rated their leaders' dominance and prestige and zero-sum mindset. And at time 2, the leader rated employees' helping behavior. And again, we controlled for a number of factors that again could influence employees' helping behavior. And again, we find support for this model. Leader dominance leads to greater zero-sum mindset and lower helping behavior among employees. Again, we find support for this mediation model. There's a bunch of other studies which rule out other mechanisms, and I'm happy to speak about it if you have any questions about it. Overall, this project was looking at what happens when we are working under a dominant leader, and using this social cognition perspective, I argued it changes people's construal of success and has an unintentional side effect in terms of their reduced helping behavior. So just to conclude, the dissertation was looking at dominance and prestige and the underlying theme, and it looked at why there is inconsistent finding in the literature for punishment of high social actors. Even though we want to punish dominant actors, why do we still vote for them? And what happens once these dominant leaders are at the helm? How does it changes our psychology and behavior? With that, I just want to thank you for this award and for listening to this dissertation. It's a long one. I want to really thank my advisor, Neeraj Sivanathan, because of whom this would not have been possible. And as they say, at least in my country, it takes a village to raise a child, and I would say it takes a village to raise a PhD student as well. So I want to thank some of these influential members of my village who did a great job in helping me. Subra Tangirala, he's at University of Maryland. Madan Pilotla, Daniel Afron, and Dan Cable, they are at London Business School. So just want to thank them for their support. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer or hear any question if there is time. Thank you.
Very well done.
Yeah, thank you, Hemant. That was great. And maybe we'll take a couple questions and then we'll have our next presenter. Neer, go ahead.
Thanks, Hemant. I would love to know your thoughts related to kind of economic uncertainty's effect on the preference for dominant leaders. Specifically, the kind of based on prospect theory, I could imagine that people are sensitive to changes in economic circumstances rather than to the actual outcome. So we can think about persistent poverty as one set of circumstances, or a decline. Do you have kind of differential predictions for persistent poverty and how that relates to preference for dominance versus a period of decline in the preference for dominant leaders?
Yeah, so great point, Neer. So I think my guess would be, we'll see more acute effects for the changes as people do get used to it, even though poverty is bad, but if it is persistent, if it is constant, people would get used to it. But changes in the negative direction, even like you said, prospect theory, people are more they respond more to losses. So if there is a decline in the negative direction, I think we should see this effect more strongly. So, and one of the studies, and I think you know it well, the World Value Survey, where we looked at 70 countries. So the effect we find is there for the absolute levels of economic uncertainty, but in the paper, the effect that we show for is looking at the difference between the level of unemployment in the previous year versus the current year. So showing that this effect is even there for that. So I truly agree, that we'll see more acute effects for the changes rather than absolute.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm thinking of what's the mindset of a dominant leader, and I'm thinking of autocrats. And I can imagine them perhaps at a deep level knowing that they're wanted in uncertainty, but also more likely to get punished. And I wonder if that contributes to a sense of paranoia or some dynamics of those authoritarian leaders that sort of even amps up their sense of control. I mean, there might be one might feed back on the other.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thanks for this important point. And time and again, some of the studies that I cited in this work by John Maynard and colleagues, they actually do find that, when these dominant leaders, they find their position to be a little bit unstable, even a little bit shaky, they amp up their level of these dominant tactics, so they engage in these behaviors by segregating those employees who could be challenging their position, or making sure that the employees are not able to talk to each other just because they might pose a threat. They could, this idea of divide and rule, they could, so that they are not able to band against this leader. So this is very much a part of their psychology, is this desire for control, which makes them monitor everyone around them. And any small threat, like you said, amps up this idea for greater control. So it's very much there.
Okay, can I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah.
Hemant, and then we'll move to the next presentation after your comment and question.
Okay, thank you, Hemant, for this presentation. I was really inspired by how you actually built on the real world and the news and everything around you to plus the theory to build this project. So congratulations on that. And on that note, I was hoping you could say some words about the fall of dominant leaders with what's happening in Cuba currently. So to what extent can this uncertainty and this poverty stay for a long time? So is this an effect that can stay in the long term?
Yeah, I mean, no, thanks for your comment and for the kind words. But I mean, I really can't say based on research. I don't have any data to support it. But historically speaking, and a lot of times, like it goes back to the question which Neer asked. Like, is this persistent poverty, or decline, which kind of makes people take certain kind of collective action? And we go back to some of these political histories, we'll see, that a lot of time these collective actions have resulted in downfall of these dominant leaders. But a lot of these regimes, they have lacked stability over a period of time. So we saw a great thing happen in Egypt, but it didn't last for long. So I don't have a good answer for it, but I would say, downfall of these leaders generally happen with some sort of collective action. It could be military, it could be civil, or whatnot. But I think the more important part is, does it stay the same? And for that, the history tells us it's probably not. So there are very few instances where something like this happens and then the nation becomes democratic. So those are exceptions rather than, unfortunately, the norm.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And so please join me in congratulating Hemant again for this outstanding dissertation. I also want to point out that Hemant is a double award winner this year. His student was awarded the best IACM conference paper with a student as first author, and that is Asher Lawson, who's working at Duke University, and they presented that paper, I think, the first day, on tribalism and tribulations, the social cost of not sharing fake news. So congratulations, Hemant, for that, both the Outstanding Dissertation Award and for the Outstanding Conference Paper with the student as first author. And we look forward to learning more about your work.
Thank you. I'm very grateful. Thank you so much.
Okay, with that, we're going to now turn to our next presenter, which is Neer Halevy. The Outstanding Publication Award this year was chaired by Jimena Ramirez Marin, who's one of our at-large board members, and the committee was also included Noam Ebner, another at-large board member, Daisun Jang, and Andrew Carton. The winning paper this year was a paper published in 2019 in the Academy of Management Annals, Brokerage and Brokering, an Integrative Review and Organizing Framework for Third-Party Influence. I was not on the committee, but wholeheartedly agree that it's a phenomenal paper, and I look forward to hearing Neer present it. So Neer, we will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Thea, for the kind introduction. Thank you everyone for the committee members for the award and for the opportunity to present this work. And we're a relatively small group, so I would love for this to be interactive. So if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to jump in and kind of share your thoughts and questions. I want to acknowledge my collaborators on this work, so Eliran Halali and Julian Zlatev, and we had a great time working together on this paper. In terms of outline for the talk today, I'm going to focus primarily on this paper, which was acknowledged. Eliran was also also collaborator with Thea and myself, in a first use case that I will share today, just to illustrate potentially the usefulness of the theory for empirical research. So we're going to see how we can build on the framework to answer the question, how does brokering influence social capital? And then I'll try to illustrate a second use case for the framework by asking and addressing the question of how does gender influence brokering behavior. So hopefully across the different kind of projects, you'll be able to see both the theoretical framework as well as its potential uses in empirical research. The project overall, or the series of projects, started with a question of how do social networks change? And this is a broad question, and I'll just give you the kind of main takeaway right now, and I'll try to kind of convince you during my talk today that we have at least initial evidence for all of these things. Our tentative answer to the question of how do social networks change? Well, one way in which it changes when brokers, third parties, create new ties for other individuals in their network, when they terminate ties between other individuals in their network, when they act to reinforce either positive or negative ties, or when they transform ties from negative to positive or vice versa. And so we're going to try to encompass all of that within a single framework. The starting point in terms of diving into the literature was kind of the observation by Simmel that social life is constantly determined in its course by the presence of the third person. And when we started reading the literature on third-party influence, it became quickly apparent that there are multiple and parallel literatures that don't always converse with each other. We have the bystander intervention in dangerous emergencies literature in psychology. We know that third parties play a critical role in the enforcement of social norms. They punish when people violate fairness or norms of justice. There is literature in sociology on brokers, structural brokers as bridges who help people kind of cross gaps in the social structure. There was research that Hemant mentioned earlier by Case and Manor and others on dominant bosses who try to kind of unravel social structure for their own selfish causes and purposes. And we have the literature in conflict management, obviously, on third-party conflict management, mediators, arbitrators, and so on. So the breadth and the kind of history of the work was pretty broad. It ranges from evidence that ancestral pan, the shared antecedent of humans, bonobos, and chimpanzees, already engage in third-party influence in the context of conflict in groups, and goes all the way to large-scale intergroup conflict, where we have here Jimmy Carter mediating between Israel and Egypt in the peace accord in the Middle East some 40 years ago. And so the challenge was to try to integrate these distinct literatures into a single framework where we would be able to use a common language to describe and explain distinct and quite diverse phenomena. We came up with a framework we call the core framework, changing others' relationship framework. We think that's the key aspect of brokering behavior. You act on and influence other people's relationships. And we began our conceptualization with a definition by David Obstfeld and colleagues that brokering behavior entails influencing, managing, or facilitating interactions between other actors. As you can see from this definition, the focus was primarily on positive behaviors here. We're going to look at both positive and negative behaviors throughout the projects I'll present today. When we think about brokering, we take a broad view. So job referrals, malicious and benevolent gossip, mediating, even romantic matchmaking, all qualifies as forms of brokering in our perspective. And to be able to encompass this broad range of phenomena, we deviate from prevailing models. Prevailing models argue or take a very structural perspective and argue that brokers only mediate between alter A and alter C, between two other individuals in their network, when there's a gap in the social structure, when A and C are not already connected in some way. In contrast, we propose that brokering is about changing others' ties both when they already have a pre-existing relationship, so you can change a negative relationship into a positive relationship or vice versa, and when there is no pre-existing tie or when it is neutral, right? So we want to consider both mediation and moderation of the relationship between A and C. To map the different literatures reviewed in this AOM Annals paper, we considered the nature of interdependence between the parties, between A and C, before the third party, before the broker intervened, relative to the nature of their interdependence or relationship after the third party or broker has intervened. And for simplicity's sake, we're going to treat them as negative, non-existing or neutral, and positive. We know this is a great simplification of interdependence theory. We'll talk later a little bit about which dimensions of interdependence we actually work on in this framework. To illustrate how we apply this to the broad literature on third-party influence, if you think about intermediaries such as brokers in deal making or organizational boundary spanners, you can think about third parties or brokers that transform a non-existing pre-intervention tie into a positive post-intervention tie between alters. When we think about dividers, people who spread malicious gossip or dominance-seeking bosses of the kind we discussed earlier, those are the brokers transform a positive pre-intervention tie or relationship into a negative post-intervention relationship. And obviously, in the context of IACM, we know quite a bit on the actions of brokers who transform a negative pre-intervention relationship into a positive post-intervention relationship. Those would be the conciliators in this overall model. Brokering allows third parties to influence two fundamental dimensions of interdependence. One is the extent to which parties are interdependent. Right? They create new relationships, they terminate existing relationships. That influences the degree of interdependence. Third parties also influence correspondence of interests, right? They can reinforce a tie, making a weak tie stronger. They can change the sign of interdependence from negative to positive and vice versa. They can make a unidimensional tie, a multiplex tie, right? Making, let's say you have a colleague at work and someone else helped you become friends at a personal level beyond the professional relationship, right? So a previously uniform or unidimensional tie is now a multiplex tie. Let's consider next how we can potentially use this framework to answer empirical questions that has been of interest to network researchers. In the first use case I'll share today, we're going to unpack brokering to these distinct social influence processes we identified in the previous slides. Then we're going to share a scale that hopefully provides a common language for considering different kinds of brokering side by side. And if you dive into the full paper, I'm not going to have time to discuss it today. You can also see rich portraits of brokers, their motives, their traits, their social skills related to distinct brokering behaviors. So this is the scale, and the green kind of items capture intermediary behaviors that create new ties for others. The yellow items, or the items under the yellow bar, capture conciliatory behaviors, such as I mediate, arbitrate, or otherwise help others settle dispute. And the items under the red bar capture divisive brokering, right? So I pit people against each other, I create tension and rivalry between other people. I will just note here that the intermediary items here were adapted in the next paper you're going to see, just because COVID-19 happened, as we all know, and the items here relied on kind of a lot of direct contact, face-to-face contact, and so we also created items to capture in a separate paper broader behaviors unconstrained by circumstances. I'm going to share with you one study from that paper related to brokering and social capital, and this is one where we studied brokering behavior and social capital in the context of roommates on campus. What we did here is we asked roommates to participate in a two-wave study. The two waves were separated by a month, and roommates reported their own brokering behavior using the brokering orientation scale. They reported their roommates' brokering behavior. They reported their roommates' impact on their own social network, and they reported their roommates' social capital in general. And so across the two waves, we had a little over 300 observations. These are just items kind of so you know how we assessed people's experiences that their roommate influenced their own network ties. So my roommate helped me form new connections with others. That would be an intermediary item. Helped me manage or resolve disagreements. Number 4 would be a conciliatory item, and weakened my ties with others. Number 9 would be a divisive item. Thank you, Hemant, for sharing with us work on prestige and dominance. These were 2 of the measures we employed here, in addition to status more broadly in a generic fashion and trust. And so these are 4 distinct kinds of social capital or measures tracking social capital that we used in this research. And we have several interesting patterns. I'm not going to dive too deeply into all of them. I'll highlight a couple that I think are particularly notable. You have here, let's consider the first model here and the effects on status. This is ego, the individual reporting on their own brokering orientations. And when you consider here the D, these are individuals reporting that they themselves engage in divisive brokering. They make other people fight. They spread malicious gossip. They create hostility and rivalry. The status is reported by their roommate. People who, in their own admission, engage in divisive brokering are said by their roommates to have higher status on campus. That means, going back again to the great presentation Hemant gave earlier, that they're good at going about their divisive brokering. They're successful in their kind of malicious gossip and so on. Otherwise, we shouldn't see those positive effects on status. When we think about the effects on kind of prestige, the kind of more benign form of status, you can see that acting as a conciliator between network ties promotes prestige. Acting as a divisive agent, as a divisive broker, reduces prestige. In terms of dominance, we see a mirror image relative to what we saw earlier with prestige, and it's notable that we get kind of effects both for, if you consider, for example, the third model here for status, we get effects for your own report of how you act as a broker, your roommate's report of how you acted as a broker, and so on top of each other. And I'll just note that the strongest effects we find for trust is obviously for divisive behavior. Negative looms larger than positive, losses larger than gains. And so when brokers engage in divisive behavior, that's when we see the kind of most harm to interpersonal trust. So just to kind of, please, Nasli.
I just have a quick question. So I guess the assumption is that the observers do not realize that the ego is engaging in divisive brokering, but the outcome is successful, right? Like, so you could imagine someone that does this very incompetently, and right. I guess they would not. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, right? So you have to do this kind of behind closed doors and make sure kind of to be mindful with whom you share gossip and what are the downstream consequences and who they might share it with, or when you share secrets and so on. And so there are some interesting patterns there. For example, we find that you need extroversion, or extroverted individuals tend to engage in more intermediary behavior, which makes perfect sense, right? You need to kind of be socially outgoing to engage in creating new ties for others. Divisive behavior does not require extroversion at all, consistent with kind of what you just shared with us, right? You do that one-on-one, behind closed doors. You don't really kind of need to be very extroverted to do that. So for sure, we do think that the manner in which intermediary, conciliatory, and divisive behavior take place is quite different. Thank you. So just kind of to summarize this first use case of the framework, we find through this research that different brokering behaviors share a common core of social influence. But there are distinct correlates of being an intermediary versus conciliatory versus divisive in your brokering behavior. And we find that different brokering behaviors influence complementary aspects of social capital differently. Now, we can also think using the core framework, not just about consequences or downstream consequences of brokering behavior, but also about antecedents of brokering behavior. And in this one, we're going to focus on gender and tie strength as antecedents, and particularly interaction between them in shaping brokering behavior, specifically helpful brokering. It makes perfect sense for individuals to prioritize their close friends over their mere acquaintances, right? So we tend to help strong ties more than we help weak ties. We know more about the needs of our strong ties. We are more willing to exert effort to spend time and kind of share resources with our strong ties. And this should generalize to both helping others create new ties and repair strained ties, right? So we should see that across both intermediary and conciliatory behaviors. We propose that gender of the broker moderates the tendency to prioritize strong ties versus weak ties. Why would we expect that? There is considerable evidence, and you can see the references at the bottom of the screen, that women score higher than men on relational self-control. So their sense of interdependence is more closely aligned with close relationships rather than membership in large social categories. And there is evidence, empirical evidence for gender differences in the kinds of pro-social behaviors that men and women engage in. And so our model predicts that gender will moderate this effect of tie strength on helpful brokering, where everyone tends to help their strong ties more, but we're going to see this moderated by gender, and we're going to see mediation by relational self-control consistent with the theoretical frameworks we build on. We conducted 2 studies, one with a sample of students, one with a broader sample and larger sample, and we used the same design in both. The experimental design was gender by tie strength, and we specifically asked people to recall a time they interacted with someone with whom they have a strong connection or someone they have a weak connection. We followed definitions in the sociological literature of strong versus weak ties in creating these sets of instructions. We also assessed individual differences in relational self-control and studied to explore the mediation we proposed in the model. So statements such as, my close relationships are an important reflection of who I am, and when I think of myself, I have to think of my close friends. We used the intermediary and conciliatory items you saw earlier to assess helpful brokering. Again, these 5 items look differently than the intermediary brokering items we saw in the previous project. COVID-19 inspired us to revise the items to include behaviors that are not constrained to physical physically sharing the same space. These are the results from our studies. You can see here that men tend to engage in intermediary brokering behavior significantly more than women when it comes to weak ties. They tend to engage in conciliatory brokering behavior significantly more than women do. Also, when it comes to their weak ties, these differences are significant. The differences in terms of helping strong ties, either to make new connections or to repair strained connections, they trend in the direction of stronger for women, but that effect is not significant. So we do see this interaction, and the interaction is driven by gender differences on willingness to help weak ties as a broker. We find this in both studies and see this indirect effect of gender on brokering behavior via relational self-control as predicted. So overall, we have support for this model. And just to kind of recap, we started this conversation today asking how do social networks change? And I propose that they change in part when individuals take actions to create new ties for others, they terminate existing ties between others in their network, they reinforce positive or negative ties, and they transform ties from negative to positive and vice versa. The framework, the core framework, allows us to explore both antecedents of different brokering behaviors as well as downstream consequences. So we've looked at gender and tie strength on the antecedent side. We looked at social capital on the consequence side. hopefully there are many additional directions that people will find the framework useful for as they explore third-party influence. Thank you, everyone, for, again, the committee members for this award and the opportunity to present. And I'll just open the floor for everyone's questions.
Well, congratulations, Nir. Thank you. Let's take one or two questions, and then we'll go to the next presentation. Cindy, go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah, great presentation, really interesting work. So I know you have a new colleague coming in that studies culture, and I'm also very interested in culture. So when you were doing the paper, I was curious, is there kind of moderation by culture? On one hand, there's like this work on relational mobility, which is about, you know, the ability to break and form new ties. And some cultures are more able to form the new ties, some are less able. But there's also the work on collectivism. And sometimes there's like overlap between collectivistic countries and relationally mobile countries, like East Asian countries tend to be more relationally stable and more collectivistic. And I can imagine like in collectivistic cultures, maybe brokering comes out more, maybe it occurs more, but in relationally stable cultures where you can't really change your ties, maybe brokering happens less. So I'm curious your thoughts on all this.
I love that direction. I think there are probably effects of different cultural dimensions, both on how much brokering takes place, who engages in brokering, does it supposed to happen laterally among people at the same level of society, or top down or bottom up, as well as how brokering is done, directly or indirectly. There is research on job referrals, in particular in sociology, across many locations on the from former USSR countries to kind of Latin America. So there's really interesting research on that, but to the best of my knowledge, not one that systematically looks at effects of culture on brokering behavior. I'll just say that I think it's interesting to consider brokering that happens within a particular social group or a network versus across group boundaries. I think it would be really interesting to explore whether in cultures that are higher on collectivism and kind of power distance and so on, whether there is more or less brokering within a group, within an organization, let's say, than across. And so this is a future direction. So I would love to chat with you and anyone and everyone else is interested.
Yeah, I would love that. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I think it's just so we make sure we have enough time for the next presentation, we're going to move on. I mean, I know Nir would be happy to answer questions at the end of the session and afterwards. So I'm going to put in the chat the link to the award-winning article. So the next presentation is for negotiation and conflict management research, our IACM journal, the Article of the Year Award. This is for 2020. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dale Hample and Jessica Hample to IACM, as I think this is their first IACM, and to recognize this phenomenal paper. This paper and all others from our archives and moving forward are all free to anyone in the world at any time via the new NCMR website, given we are now a Platinum Open Access journal. So that link that I put in the chat, you can download the paper for free. I encourage you to cite it, put it everywhere on social media for all NCMR articles, because we want to get the word out. This committee was chaired by the NCMR editor-in-chief, Chi Wang, and her committee included Bing Han, Lan Ni, who's the associate editor, and Laura Reese. The title of the paper is "There Is No Way. Where Do People Go When They Avoid an Interpersonal Conflict?" And I will turn it over to Dale and Jessica to present their work. Thank you and congratulations.
Thank you. I'm trying to get the software. Okay. Jessica and I are, oh, by the way, she's my daughter, not my wife. We're very grateful for this award. It kind of came out of the blue. We were happy that the journal took the paper, and then all of a sudden we got this notification. It's like having an extra birthday. So thank all of you. All of you probably got essentially the same graduate education that we did at first. And you remember being told how to do research and how you read the literature and you extract axioms and postulates and you develop theories and deduce hypotheses. And Jessica and I didn't do any of that. What happened was, I was walking through my building one day. I had an undergraduate class later in the day, and I was going to explain integrative, distributive, and avoidant conflict strategies, right? You know, I mean, undergraduates, I was going to thrill them with these insights. And as I was thinking through it in my head, I realized that I had very little to tell them about avoidance. And as this thought occurred to me, my eyes fell on these two trash bins. They're always side by side in the building. And the one on the left is the recycling one, and the one on the right is the trash one. And like other places, they try to discourage throwing stuff in the trash that can be recycled. And so they have this slogan that's extremely common in the US. I don't know about other countries. Throwing that away, there is no away. And, you know, it shows this picture of the landfill, I guess. And it occurred to me in that moment that when people avoid conflict, there's no away. They do something. They go someplace, they think about something else, they engage in something else. And I realized that I had personally very little information about where they go and what they do. And so Jessica and I decided to initiate this very exploratory study. And what you're going to hear is mainly our coding of a zillion open-ended questions in which we just asked people to tell us about conflicts they had avoided, and some of the questions got increasingly focused. And we coded the daylights out of it, and the paper itself has, I don't know, 100 or 200 specific results in it. So in writing the paper and in giving this talk, what I'm trying to do is tell a story and pick out a couple of the salient things, but there's a great deal more in the paper itself. A good place to begin is by reflecting for a moment on what avoidance is. And it turns out that conflict avoidance is every human capability except engaging in that conflict in that moment. And right here you see our problem. The list of avoidant behaviors or cognitive states is, if not infinite, at least innumerably large. And it's very hard for us to get a handle on the specific affirmative concrete things that people are doing. And as you'll see in a moment, this has caused us to understand and define and operationalize avoidance as the absence of whatever that particular research project is actually about. If the paper is about competition versus cooperation, avoidance is everything that is not cooperative or competitive, right? And you know, the same for other sorts of investigations. So it's basically a black hole, you know, conceptually. Every avoidance, however, is an actual human action. It is an actual motivated thing. And that means that it has a push and a pull. The push is not wanting to do that conflict with that person. And if I'm avoiding a conflict with you because I really detest you, just measuring how much I detest you is really going to protect my avoidance pretty well. But if I'm avoiding a conflict with you because I'm busy and I really need to do something else, then any information we have about you or the conflict topic is going to be irrelevant to predicting and understanding the avoidance. And it's the pull that we have almost no information about. For example, suppose you had a choice between the things in the left column and the things in the right column. You can talk with your spouse about a financial problem, or you can get in the car and go to your best friend's bridal shower. Well, you may not want to talk about the financial problem, that's the push, but the pull is going to that bridal shower where you're expected. You can take up a complicated argument with a close friend, or you can get to your bowling league on time. You can talk to your surly teenage son. That's kind of duplicative, surly and teenage, about his algebra grade, or you could just relax and have a glass of wine. Now, if you avoid the conflicts on the left, is it because you were pushed away from an unpleasant situation, or because there was a pull of something more attractive or more needful that you wanted to do? If we're going to understand avoidance, we need to have more information than we do about the pull. If you look at how we operationalize avoidance, these are actual items that we extracted from various self-report measures on a number of different things. I listened to my partner's point of view. Well, that's engagement. It's concrete. It's observable. I threatened my partner. Well, you can see that too. I compromised with my partner. Totally observable. The argument involved loud and negative voices. You see, all of our indices of engagement are observable because these are affirmative behaviors. But when we go to measure avoidance, as the items on the right, I avoided my partner. Well, how do you see that? All you see is a person doing something other than engaging. I changed the topic of discussion. You can see a topic change, but you can't really see the motivation for it. I tried to stay away from disagreement with my blank, my boss, my wife, my whatever. This is one of the Rahim scales. What does that look like? Just not doing the disagreement. I try to keep my disagreement with my blank to myself in order to avoid hard feelings. Well, all of these operationalizations are things that didn't happen, and they're really hard to see, and they're really absences, not accomplishments. And so our basic research question was, where do people go and what do they think when they are avoiding? We combined two samples. We didn't do any real comparisons between the samples. We just wanted more variability in the data set. Lots and lots of open-ended questions about a potential conflict that you avoided, and all of the questions are in the paper. And there were a few closed-end questions because we anticipated that people could leave physically or mentally. They could do it before the conflict began or during the conflict. And so I have largely left out our literature review, but we did actually read things instead of just staring at trash bins. So we had some things that we anticipated, but most of what we were looking for was things that we could extract from their open-ended answers. So where do people go? We've structured things so that you could avoid physically and or mentally and or any of these other ways. So these were not choices. About half of the people avoided physically. They left the room, they hung up the phone, we counted that as physical. We also noticed in our coding that physical avoidance wasn't possible 30% of the time. So maybe it just wasn't reasonable to expect somebody to be able to leave the room or something like that. So physical departure occurred half the time out of 70% of the time when it was possible. Same sort of thing resulted when we coded for people leaving mentally, where you just tune out, change the topic, change what you're doing, so you're staying there, but you're not cognitively or emotionally focusing on the conflict topic. And again, this was coincidental. We coded that mental avoidance really wasn't possible 30% of the time, or it wasn't feasible. Obviously, you could go into some sort of trance or something, but just as ordinary human behavior, it was only a plausible reaction 70% of the time. About 40% of our respondents avoided during the conflict. That is to say, the conflict got underway, and then they realized this is going in a bad direction, and they got out. And in the avoidance during the conflict, a very common tactic was fake agreement or insincere concessions. Just say whatever you got to say to get out of this topic. That didn't really appear in the situations where people were avoiding the conflict before it got going. And 40% of the conflicts never started. This is interesting. The possibility or likelihood of a conflict was foreseeable, and people headed it off before the conflict ever got going. Oh, I probably should have mentioned that we're studying interpersonal conflicts here. Okay, so people know that it's going to happen, and they don't want to do it, and they find a way to derail the episodic trajectory before they ever get there. One of the genuinely novel findings, and this was intrigued us quite a bit, when people avoid, about 80% of the people went to a familiar place if they were avoiding physically, or they went to a familiar thought or fantasy or something like that if they were avoiding mentally. And once we noticed this, we thought that it might have been lurking in the background of several of the other things that we noticed in our coding. And I think that the idea of familiarity is perhaps a considerable clue to what's to people's choice of avoidance tactics. As I said, a lot of the conflicts never got underway, so people were able to anticipate the conflicts. An important clue was the topic. About half of the avoided conflicts were or were going to be serial arguments. I don't know how common that phrase is in this community. Most of my own research is in argumentation. A serial argument is an argument that recurs over and over again in a relationship. And they're really, really important. If I told you that there were two romantic couples, and one of them is continuously having arguments about whether they could have a child, and the other one is continuously having arguments about which is better, heroin or methamphetamine, you've really got an insight into the character of those two couples, right? And so serial arguments are extremely informative. And at any rate, in the argumentation community, serial arguments has been a relatively large research interest. And so you recognize the topic, you recognize that we've already had half a dozen engagements about this, and we're probably going to have half a dozen more, and I just don't want to do it right now. Also, people anticipated and then avoided conflicts because they perceived threats to the relationship between them and the other person, threat to their own self-image, the threat of an emotional explosion, or the threat of violence of some sort. I'll talk more about violence in a minute, but people just had a sense that one of these things was going to happen, and they got out before it started. There were also what we call catalysts. We were never sure about this term, but they were circumstances that just made this a wrong activity for you in the moment. For instance, your feelings. You could be upset about something else and you just don't want to talk about anything that might be complicated. You have certain expectations for what's supposed to be going on in this interaction, and this isn't it. or their threat to group identity. Group identity as a woman came up a lot. We have women in the audience, and maybe you can tolerate, maybe one episode a day of mansplaining is just the way your day goes. And the second episode starts to annoy you, and the third episode, hell no, you're getting out of there. So it might be, you know, a threat to your identity combined with your feelings and stuff like that. So we called this sort of thing catalysts. We also measured the stakes of the conflict topic, and of the avoided conflicts, 40% of the stakes were relational. You know, will this damage our friendship or our romance or something like that? Half of the stakes were emotional. You know, is this depressing or enraging or something like that? Material resources were relatively uncommon compared to the relational and the emotional stakes that were involved in stimulating avoidance. Violence, actual physical violence occurred very rarely, only 3 or 4 instances that we thought we could even plausibly say were physical violence. But we found verbal violence in about a quarter of the instances, and emotional violence were very common in conflicts that were avoided. Remember, not all conflicts, just the one that people fled. In spite of very little actual physical violence, in 20% of the cases, people thought it was possible. 60% of the time, they thought verbal violence was possible. Somebody was going to yell at me or insult me. Interestingly, men were more concerned about it than women were. This surprised us a little bit, but maybe men are more sensitive to it because possibly they do it more often. So physical violence was, as we said in the paper, more atmospheric than observable. But it's also possible that our respondents correctly saw it coming and got out. So maybe it didn't happen in our data set because people competently avoided it. And if so, good for them. But we can't resolve that with our data. Avoided conflicts have a future for the participants. As I said earlier, many of them were serial arguments, and so you knew the topic was going to recur. 66% of our respondents planned for a future encounter on this topic. And we asked them, what are you going to do? And we coded their plans, and this is sort of subjective, but intelligently subjective on the part of our coders. 37% of their plans seem to be constructive, 6% of them seem to be very clearly destructive, and 23% of their plans were more avoidance. And what this means is that people think of avoidance as an actual tactic, not just the absence of being realistic or unrealistic, dialogic or monologic, or in any of the contrasts that we have in our literature. They think that avoidance is an actual thing. We also asked about rumination, and it was mostly negative. Mostly people would kind of review it in their mind and get madder and madder, and we labeled this festering anger, and it was by far the most common characteristic of rumination. So takeaways from the study. First of all, avoidance is not just a human instantiation of missing data. Now, we emphasize it's not a criticism of anybody's research. If you're doing a study on cooperative versus competitive tactics, then people who avoid really are missing data for you. All right, so I mean, it's a perfectly intelligent research strategy. But we are missing something because avoidance is actually a thing, even if it can take an innumerably large number of forms. We think that it's important to identify the push and the pull of avoidance. The push is that conflicts are stressful. And avoidance is a coping mechanism. And as we've reviewed in literature that I haven't shared with you, it's a perfectly effective coping mechanism. There's nothing deficient about it. Once we had this thought, though, it occurred to us that all conflict tactics are coping mechanisms. You've got a conflict, which is a stress, and you can cope with it by trying to resolve it in a constructive way. You can cope with it by being domineering and trying to bully the other party into leaving. You can cope with it by avoiding, and just a huge list. And in psych, they have an enormous literature on coping and ego defense. And we ought to be looking at that to get insights into our lists of tactics, which are also coping mechanisms. There ought to be an integration. The pole of avoidance is that what you're doing instead of the conflict may be genuinely attractive on its own, and we should try to understand that. Our final large thought that I hope you'll take away is that avoidance is an affirmative action. It is not merely a missing tactic. It's not just an absence, and it deserves more study than we have done, I think. We're extremely grateful for the Article of the Year award. Oh, the plaques are cool. I was quite impressed. I got this in the mail. I thought it was a book, but better than a book. Prize. So we're grateful to everyone, and thank you a lot. I should mention that Jessica and I have both changed our affiliations. I've retired from the University of Maryland, and I'm back to being a professor emeritus at Western Illinois University. And Jessica has gone to the University of Nebraska at Kearney. So we have bright spanking new email addresses and would love to hear from you. Thank you.
Well, congratulations, thank you, and congratulations on your recent moves. We have a few more minutes, we can take questions, and Nir, start us off.
Thank you, Dale. I love, and Jessica, I love the research. I think it's brilliant. I have a question inspired by Cindy's earlier reference to culture. So let's say I have a colleague and we both speak both Hebrew and English, and the language we use when we collaborate on a paper is actually signaling which set of cultural norms we're going to use when we have to resolve disagreements about the paper. So when we communicate in English about the paper, I'm going to avoid more. But since we're both Israelis by origin, when we switch to Hebrew, there is no avoidance, no holding back. So I wonder, do you have any insight about the kind of either linguistic cues or other cues in the situation, in the environment, that direct us towards avoidance versus other choices?
I have two things, and the first one is totally supportive of what you've said, and the second one is completely unsupportive. The supportive one is that I talked years ago about a man who coached debate in Japan. And he said debate's very active in Japanese high schools and colleges, but they have to debate in English, because if they try to debate in Japanese, they can't bring themselves to disagree bluntly. And so they use debate as part of the language trains. Anyone here Japanese? I don't know. Yeah. Okay, so that's completely in support of what you've said. And there's also research on arguing in Israel by a woman named Catriel, who has talked about the bluntness of Israeli culture, the Sabra culture in particular. The less supportive thing is that I have done 2 studies on personalizing conflict, taking conflict personally, in which people had a choice of languages. In Malaysia, they could do the survey and the reactions in, I forget the name of the Malay national language, or they could do it in English. And when we compared, the 2 languages were identical results. And did a similar study in Ukraine, where people could do the survey in Ukrainian or in Russian. And this is a time when they're shooting at one another, and you would think that the language would indicate, some sort of political affiliation. Once again, it made no difference. I find the question fascinating, and I don't have a clear-cut answer to you, except that I will tell you that it seems fairly evident that whatever the name of this continuum is, Israel is way on one end of it.
Thank you.
Okay.
So we are at time. We're actually past time. So I want to congratulate all the award winners, and also actually, since Ray Friedman is here, I'd like to congratulate him because he was a finalist for this NCMR award with another great NCMR paper. So we can honor them, and which is also freely available on the NCMR website. So I'll do the plug for Ray's paper on agreement fluidity. And so I encourage you to read that one and download as well, because there was some tough choices. The articles we're publishing in NCMR are continuing to be great, and we hope you all continue to think of NCMR and submit to NCMR with your best work. So with that, we will end here. I think we have some time before the next session if you want to go to the Gather or hang out here in this room. So thank you all.